The envelope slid under my door at 3:47 a.m. I know because insomnia had become my closest companion since moving into the Belmore apartments 6 months ago. The paper was cheap, the kind you'd find at any corner drugstore, deliberately untraceable. My hands trembled as I unfolded the note, and those 2 words, "You're next," seemed to pulse with malice under the dim kitchen light. But it was the number scrawled beneath them that made my heart stop. 2004. 21 years had passed. 21 years of silence, of buried secrets, of pretending that summer never happened. Only 3 people in this building knew what that year meant, what we'd done, what we'd covered up in the suffocating heat of July. I pressed my back against the cold wall, suddenly aware of how thin these apartments were, how every whisper could travel through ventilation shafts and cracked plaster. Margaret Finch in 4B had been there that night. Her eyes had held the same terror mine did when we made our pact. David Rosen in 2C had helped us, his medical expertise buying our silence with clinical precision. And then there was Elena Vargas in 3A, the one who'd suggested we never speak of it again, who'd moved into this building 3 years before I did, as if drawn by some gravitational pull of guilt. One of them had broken our vow of silence, or perhaps someone else had discovered the truth, a truth that could destroy us all. The fluorescent light above me flickered, casting dancing shadows across the linoleum floor that suddenly looked like grasping fingers. I thought of calling the police, but what would I say? That an anonymous note had referenced a year? That I was being threatened by my own past? They'd ask questions I couldn't answer. Questions that would lead them down a path none of us could afford to walk. My phone sat on the counter, screen dark, full of contacts who knew nothing about the real me, the one who existed before I became Sarah Chen. Dependable accountant, quiet neighbor, woman with no remarkable history. Before I was the girl who helped hide a body in the Belmore apartment's basement, sleep was impossible now. So I made coffee and watched the sunrise paint my walls the color of old blood. The building was waking up, pipes groaning, doors opening, the morning symphony of people who believed they were safe in their little boxes of drywall in denial. I heard Margaret's distinctive shuffle above me, her walker scraping across hardwood as it had every morning since her stroke 2 years ago. David's classical music drifted through the walls, Vivaldi's 4 Seasons, always Vivaldi, as if beautiful music could cleanse his conscience. Elena's door slammed. She was always the earliest riser, always rushing somewhere as if she could outrun what chased us all. I stood at my window, watching residents emerge into the gray October morning, and wondered which one had sent the note. Or worse, I wondered if the note hadn't come from one of us at all, but from someone who'd been watching, waiting, gathering evidence while we'd grown complacent in our collective amnesia. The Belmore apartments had always felt like a refuge, its Art Deco facade and rent-controlled units attracting people who needed to disappear into anonymity. Now it felt like a trap, and somewhere in these walls, behind one of these doors, someone knew exactly what we'd done in 2004. Someone knew. And they wanted me to understand that after 21 years, the past had finally come to collect its debt. I cornered Margaret in the mailroom at noon, her arthritic fingers fumbling with her box key while I pretended to check for packages I knew hadn't arrived. She looked older than her 68 years, the stroke having carved new lines of vulnerability into her formerly sharp features. "We need to talk," I whispered. And the way her hand froze told me everything. She'd received a note too. Her eyes darted to the security camera in the corner, the red light blinking like an accusing eye, and she shook her head with such violence that her silver curls trembled. "Not here," she mouthed, and I watched her shuffle away, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and fear. David was easier to approach because his patterns never changed. Tuesday meant groceries at exactly 2 p.m., returning by 3:15 with his reusable bags full of organic vegetables and imported cheeses. I intercepted him in the parking garage, where the fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song and our voices would echo off concrete if we weren't careful. "Did you get one too?" I asked without preamble, and his face, usually so composed, so professionally blank, crumbled. He set down his groceries, and a tomato rolled free, coming to rest against my foot like a heart someone had dropped. "Yesterday morning," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Under my door, just like..." He couldn't finish, couldn't say, just like we slid the note under his door. Couldn't reference the victim we'd all worked so hard to forget. Elena was the hardest to pin down because Elena was always moving, always had somewhere to be, some urgent errand that kept her from standing still long enough to face what we'd done. I caught her in the laundry room at 10 p.m., where she was folding clothes with mechanical precision, each movement tight and controlled. "Elena," I said, and she didn't even look up, just kept folding, creasing, stacking. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said preemptively, but her hands betrayed her. They were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against a warm towel to still them. When she finally met my eyes, I saw something that terrified me more than the note itself. Elena looked relieved, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, as if the guilt had been eating her alive, and the note was permission to finally stop pretending. We met in Margaret's apartment at midnight because hers was the only one with walls thick enough to muffle secrets, a quirk of its corner location and the original 1920s construction. The four of us sat in her living room like defendants awaiting verdict, the space between us charged with accusations we didn't dare speak aloud. Margaret laid her note on the coffee table first, then David, then Elena, then mine. 4 identical pieces of cheap paper, 4 identical messages. "You're next," and 2004. The handwriting was printed, deliberately disguised, telling us nothing except that whoever sent them wanted us to know they'd been thorough. "It could be his family," David said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched taut as wire. "Maybe they hired a private investigator. Maybe after all these years—" "It wasn't his family," Elena interrupted, and there was something in her voice that made us all turn to stare. She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face, and I realized I'd never seen Elena cry, not even that night in 2004 when we'd made our terrible choice. "I know who sent the notes," she whispered, "and it's so much worse than you think. Because the person who knows what we did, they were in the building that night too. They saw everything, and they've been living here with us all along, watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to make us pay." Her next words fell into the room like stones into a grave. "The person who sent these notes is Marcus Webb in 1A, and he's been dead for 3 days." The police had found Marcus Webb's body on Sunday morning, when Mrs. Chen from 1B complained about the smell seeping through their shared wall. Natural causes, they'd said. Heart attack. Common for a 72-year-old man who lived alone and refused to see doctors. But our notes had been delivered Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, days after Marcus Webb's heart had supposedly stopped beating in his recliner while watching the evening news. David's medical training kicked in first, his voice clinical and detached. Lividity sets in within hours. Rigor mortis begins at 2 to 6 hours. Full body rigidity by 12 hours. There's no way he physically delivered those notes. Margaret's hands clutched her walker so tightly her knuckles went white. Then someone else is using his name, pretending to be him, which means they know we know Marcus. I barely remembered Marcus Webb. He'd been a fixture in the building for decades. One of those invisible old men who collected mail and occasionally nodded hello but never engaged in conversation. Elena, however, had gone pale as milk, her breath coming in short gasps that suggested she remembered him far better than the rest of us. "He was the night janitor in 2004, she finally said, each word dragged from her throat like a confession. "He worked the graveyard shift, midnight to 6 a.m., and he had keys to every apartment, access to every floor, every storage room, every—" She couldn't continue, but she didn't need to. We all understood what she was saying. Marcus Webb had keys to the basement where we'd hidden the body, where we'd spent 3 hours in the dark, digging into the concrete with tools we'd stolen from the maintenance closet, sealing our secret behind a false wall that looked like it had been there since the building's construction. "If Marcus knew, why wait 21 years? David demanded, pacing Margaret's small living room like a caged animal. "Why not blackmail us then? Why not go to the police? Why wait until he's dying to—" He stopped mid-sentence, understanding dawning on his face with the horror of revelation. Unless he wasn't planning to expose us at all. Unless someone found evidence in his apartment after he died. Evidence he'd been keeping, documenting, preparing for... Margaret finished his thought. Preparing for someone else to finish what he started. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus Webb had created a contingency plan, a way to ensure that even in death, we would face justice for what we'd done. My phone buzzed, shattering the tense silence. And I saw a text from an unknown number. "Check your email." With trembling fingers, I opened my inbox while the others crowded around, their breath hot on my neck, their fear palpable in the stale air of Margaret's apartment. The email had no subject line, no signature, just a video attachment dated July 17th, 2004. I pressed play, and there we were, grainy security footage from the basement, time-stamped 2:47 a.m., showing 4 people dragging something heavy wrapped in plastic sheeting. The camera angle captured everything. Our faces clearly visible in the maintenance lights, our panic evident in jerky movements, our guilt immortalized in digital memory. Marcus Webb had been watching that night, had recorded everything, and now someone had his footage. The video ended with text appearing on screen. "Marcus Webb died protecting your secret. He never told anyone because he believed people could change, could earn redemption. But I don't share his faith. You have 72 hours to confess, or this video goes to the police, the media, and every resident in the Belmore apartments. The past doesn't forget, and neither do I." The screen went black, and in its reflection, I could see our 4 faces, older now, marked by time and guilt, bound together by a crime we'd thought was buried as deep as the body in the basement. Whoever had Marcus Webb's evidence wasn't interested in blackmail or money. They wanted something far more valuable and far more terrifying. They wanted the truth, and they wanted us to be the ones to tell it, to destroy our own carefully constructed lives with our own voices. We tore apart Marcus Webb's apartment with the desperate efficiency of people who had everything to lose. The police had cleared the scene after declaring his death natural, and his nephew, who'd driven in from Nebraska for the funeral, had given us permission to help clean out the old man's things. The nephew knew nothing, suspected nothing, just wanted to settle the estate and return to his life in Omaha where old men didn't die alone in rent-controlled apartments. Margaret checked the bedroom while David searched the kitchenette. Elena rifled through stacks of newspapers dating back decades, and I focused on the closet where Marcus had kept his janitor's uniforms, still hanging in plastic as if he might need them again. Behind the uniforms, I found a lockbox, and inside that lockbox, I found our nightmare, 21 years of surveillance, meticulously documented in journals, photographs, and USB drives labeled with dates and apartment numbers. Marcus Webb had been watching all of us since 2004, documenting not just that night, but everything that came after. Our relationships, our jobs, our lies, the ways we'd avoided each other and then, inexplicably, ended up living in the same building like moths drawn to the flame of our shared sin. His handwriting was neat, almost professorial, each entry clinical and precise. S. Chen, 4D, received promotion, guilt manifests as workaholism. D. Rosen, 2C, volunteers at free clinic, atonement through service. Monsieur Finch, 4B, donates to victims' rights organizations. Monthly, conscience requires transaction. E. Vargas, 3A, attends Catholic Mass daily, faith as shield against memory. He'd been studying us like specimens, and worse, his notes suggested something we'd never considered. Marcus Webb had known who we'd killed and why, had known the victim wasn't innocent, had known we'd acted in defense even if the law wouldn't see it that way. He was building a case for us, Elena whispered, holding up a journal from 2007 where Marcus had written, "They were protecting each other from a predator. The law failed them. They did what survival demanded. But they carry it like murder, and that guilt will destroy them more completely than any prison." Margaret sank into Marcus's worn recliner, her face crumbling as she read his words aloud. "I've kept their secret not because they deserve mercy, but because James Hendrick deserved what they gave him. He'd assaulted 17 women in this building over 8 years. The police did nothing. These 4 did what needed doing." David's hands shook as he discovered newspaper clippings Marcus had collected, articles about James Hendrick, the building's former maintenance supervisor, about complaints dismissed, about evidence lost, about a system that protected the predator until 4 desperate people made a different choice. But if Marcus Webb had been our unlikely guardian angel, documenting our crime as justified homicide, who had his evidence now? Who had decided Marcus's compassion was misplaced? I found the answer in the last journal entry, dated 3 weeks before his death. Told Adrian the truth today. He deserved to know why his son died, why James never came home that night. I thought understanding would bring him peace. I was wrong. He wants revenge, wants them to suffer as he's suffered. I've created his emergency contact access to give him my files if I die, thinking he'd use them to find closure. Now I fear I've armed him with the weapon to destroy 4 people who were just trying to survive. Adrian Hendrick, James's father, the man we'd thought was dead or distant, had been watching us through Marcus's notes, learning our routines, our vulnerabilities, our secrets. The lock on Marcus's door rattled, and we froze like animals sensing a predator. Through the peephole, I saw him. Adrian Hendrick, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, using a key that must have been Marcus's to enter the apartment he now knew we'd invaded. "I wondered when you'd come looking," he said calmly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a click that sounded like a cell door slamming. "Marcus told me you were good people, that what you did to my son was justified, that James was a monster who'd hurt countless women and would have hurt more." His voice was steady, almost conversational, but his eyes held the flat deadness of someone who'd already decided our fates. But Marcus wasn't a father. Marcus didn't spend 67 years raising a boy, loving him despite his flaws, hoping he'd change. "You took my son's chance at redemption, and now I'm going to take everything from you. Your freedom, your reputations, your futures. Unless..." He paused, and that pause contained multitudes of threat. "Unless you can convince me why you deserve the mercy you never showed James." Adrian Hendrick sat in his dead son's apartment. Because of course he'd been renting it under a false name for months, living 1 floor below me while plotting our destruction, and waited for us to justify 21 years of freedom. Margaret spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. "Your son assaulted me in the laundry room in 2002, held a knife to my throat and told me if I screamed he'd make sure I never spoke again." She pulled up her shirt to reveal a scar that ran from her collarbone to her sternum, a thin white line that had faded with time but never disappeared. David continued the litany. "He attacked my girlfriend in the parking garage. She moved to California the next day and never came back. And when I went to the police, they said there wasn't enough evidence." Elena's voice broke as she added, "He assaulted my daughter when she came to visit, and she was only 16, and the police said it was he said she said, and she tried to kill herself 2 months later." I was the last to speak, and my words felt like stones in my mouth. "He raped me in the basement maintenance room where we later buried him, told me he chose that spot specifically because no one could hear screaming through the concrete walls." Adrian's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, not sympathy, but perhaps recognition that the son he'd mourned wasn't the son he'd thought he knew. The night we killed him, he'd lured Elena down to the basement with a fake maintenance request. We found him trying to assault her again, and we didn't plan it, didn't discuss it. We just acted. David hit him with a wrench, Margaret held him down, Elena grabbed his keys to lock the door, and I couldn't finish, but I didn't need to. Adrian knew what I'd done, knew I'd been the one to make sure James Hendrick never hurt anyone again. "Marcus's journals have all of this," David said quietly, gesturing to the evidence spread across the apartment. Victim statements he collected, police reports that went nowhere, hospital records that documented injuries but never resulted in charges. Your son was a serial predator, and the system protected him for 8 years until we couldn't wait anymore, until one of us was going to end up dead if we didn't act. Adrian stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the Belmore Apartments courtyard where his son had once worked, where he'd had access to vulnerable women, where he'd operated with impunity because people trusted the friendly maintenance man. "I know what James was," he finally said, his voice thick with emotions I couldn't name. "Marcus made me read everything before he died, made me confront what I'd chosen to ignore, to excuse, to explain away as misunderstandings or mistakes or moments of weakness. Then why?" Elena demanded, standing despite her shaking legs. "Why threaten us if you know we had no choice? Why torture us with those notes? Why send us that video? Why make us relive the worst night of our lives?" Adrian turned from the window, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of rage barely contained. "Because you gotta go on living," he said simply. "You got jobs and relationships and 21 years of breathing and laughing and existing while my son rotted behind a false wall in a basement. You got therapy and peace and the chance to heal while I buried an empty coffin. Because you'd hidden his body so well the police declared him missing, but never found." His hand went to his pocket, and we all tensed, but what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a phone. "I wanted to make you feel what I felt. Hunted, helpless, haunted by the past." The phone in his hand displayed a video chat application, and on the screen was a woman's face, older, with kind eyes and a prosecutor's steel in her expression. "This is my sister, District Attorney Rachel Hendrick," Adrian said. "She's been listening to everything, and she's the one who'll decide what happens next." Rachel's voice came through the speaker, professional and measured. "I've reviewed Marcus Webb's files, the evidence of my nephew's crimes, and the circumstances of his death. Legally, you committed manslaughter at minimum. Morally, you acted in defense of immediate threat. The statute of limitations has expired for most of what James did, but not for his death." She paused, and in that pause hung our futures. "However, I've also reviewed 17 victim statements that were dismissed, ignored, or buried by a system that failed to protect you. I can't promise you'll walk away free, but I can promise you'll finally have your day in court, not as killers, but as survivors who fought back when no one else would fight for them." Adrian lowered the phone, and I realized he'd never wanted revenge. He'd wanted justice, for us and for the women his son had hurt, even if that justice came 21 years too late. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a media sensation. Not because we'd killed a man, but because we'd killed a serial predator the system had protected, and that made us both criminals and symbols of a broken justice system. Rachel Hendrick prosecuted with the precision her position demanded, but she did something remarkable. She presented Marcus Webb's journals as evidence, let 17 victims testify about what James Hendrick had done, and built a case that acknowledged our guilt, while demanding the court acknowledge what had driven us to it. We pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter with mitigating circumstances, the only honest thing we could do after 21 years of lying. The judge, a woman in her 50s who'd spent her career prosecuting violence against women, listened to every word of testimony, read every page of Marcus's documentation, and then did something unexpected. She sentenced us to time served, 5 years probation, and mandatory community service with organizations supporting assault survivors. Adrian attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where we could see him, where his presence reminded us that justice was complicated and forgiveness wasn't always possible or even appropriate. On the last day, after the judge's ruling, he approached us in the courthouse hallway while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. "Marcus was right about you," he said quietly, speaking only to us while chaos swirled around us. "You're not monsters. You're people who did a monstrous thing because you were out of options. But my son is still dead, and I still have to live with what he did, with what I didn't see or chose not to see." He handed me a small box, and inside was a key, Marcus Webb's key to the Belmore apartments. He wanted you to have this, wanted you to know someone saw you, knew you, and chose to keep your secret because he believed people were more than their worst moments. The Belmore apartments felt different when we returned. Not haunted anymore, but honest, like a wound that had finally been exposed to air and could begin to heal. Margaret moved to Arizona to live with her daughter, finally leaving the building that had been her prison and refuge. David opened a clinic specifically for assault survivors, using his medical expertise to help people the system had failed as it had failed us. Elena started a nonprofit connecting victims with legal resources, creating the support network that hadn't existed for us in 2004. And I began writing, not fiction, but testimony, documenting Marcus Webb's journals and the stories of women whose voices had been silenced, making sure what happened to us could never be hidden or dismissed again. Adrian Hendrick sold his apartment, the one he'd rented under false pretenses to spy on us. But before he left, he helped us excavate James's body from the basement, giving his son a proper burial, while police documented the crime scene we'd created 21 years earlier. There was something almost ceremonial about it, about finally bringing darkness into light, about admitting what we'd done and why we'd done it. "I don't forgive you," Adrian told us at the reburial, standing at a grave that now had his son's real name on the headstone. "But I understand you. And maybe that's the closest we get to peace in this world. Understanding that sometimes terrible things happen because worse things came first." His sister stood beside him, and together they represented the complexity of justice, punishment and mercy, accountability and compassion, all existing simultaneously, like the contradictions we'd become. Years have passed now, and I still live in the Belmore apartments. Though most of the residents have changed and the building has been renovated, its Art Deco facade restored to glory, while its dark history becomes legend. I keep Marcus Webb's journals on my shelf, a reminder that someone saw us at our worst and chose to document not just our crime, but our humanity. The note that started everything, "You're next," with 2004 scrawled beneath, sits framed on my desk, no longer a threat, but a promise. That the past will always find us, that secrets eventually demand to be told, that sometimes the only way forward is through confession. Every morning I wake in the apartment where an anonymous letter changed everything. And I'm grateful for the terror it brought, for the exposure it demanded, for the painful, necessary reckoning that taught me we're only as sick as our secrets. Adrian was right. We weren't monsters, but we'd done a monstrous thing. And living with that truth, finally speaking it aloud, was the only way any of us could become whole again.